Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're opening a really specific window, maybe a tiny one, into the late years of the German Democratic Republic. We're talking East Germany, 1987.
Yeah, but probably not the subjects people usually think of. No Trabants today, no Berlin Wall focus.
Nope. Today it's the Hive Wars.
Exactly. We're looking at this um, really fiercely contested, surprisingly technical revolution happening in, well, what seems like the quietest corners of the country, beekeeping.
Right. Who knew beekeeping could be so intense?
Well, the sources we've got, these are technical bits from a 1987 beekeeping journal, Garten und Kleintierzucht. They detail this incredibly intense, almost, you could say, absurd debate fought over things like wooden frames and insulation.
And this tiny fight, it kind of perfectly exposed these huge underlying tensions, didn't it?
Absolutely. You see the clash between this really deep-seated German tradition, the, global drive for efficiency that was happening everywhere, and then the harsh realities of the GDR's centrally planned scarcity economy, the Mangelwirtschaft.
So this is really a deep dive into innovation under constraint. Our mission today, let's unpack this super technical debate. It was all about whether East German beekeepers should ditch their traditional hives for the global standard Langstroth hive.
And we want to identify the unique economic and cultural pressures in the GDR that made this switch so incredibly difficult. What does this tiny struggle actually tell us about trying to innovate, trying to modernize, when supply chain is, frankly, always broken?
And we even have a snapshot of the people driving this, right? It wasn't just theory.
No, not at all. The sources mentioned it was a real schism.
Yeah.
In October '87, you had almost 30 really motivated beekeepers do something pretty radical. They split off from the main Rostock Association.
Wow.
Yeah, formed their own group, the Broderstorf.
So they were the radicals, jumping the gun on a change that wouldn't really take hold until after the wall fell.
Pretty much. They were already Magazine Beekeepers. They were basically saying, we're done waiting.
Mm-hmm.
They were convinced efficiency was the only path forward, and they were ready to leave the traditionalists behind.
Okay, so let's dive into what exactly they were rebelling against. Because to get the fight, you really have to understand the history, the heritage they were challenging. All right, let's unpack this history a bit. We need to start with the status quo, what German beekeeping looked like, really stretching back, to the mid-19th century?
Oh, easily, yeah.
Yeah.
When you talk about German beekeeping history, especially from around 1848, when the German Beekeepers Association got going, the defining thing was the Hinterbehandlungsbeet.
Okay, Hinterbehandlung, that means rear access hive.
Exactly, rear access. And crucially, you have to understand, these weren't just simple boxes like you might picture. They were often built into things, specialized, sometimes architecturally, really quite something, bee houses, Bienenhäuser.
Right, I've seen pictures, almost like little sheds or cabinets just for bees.
Or, very commonly, these complex, multi-compartment mobile trailers, the Wanderwagen. Big, heavy things.
So, listener, picture this, not just a stack of boxes out in the yard. It's more like a wall of specialized drawers, maybe? Or like a small cupboard built right into a dedicated structure.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You'd access the combs from the back, literally pulling them out like a file drawer. And in 1987, the vast majority of beekeepers in the GDR were still using these big, often fixed units.
And they were successful with them, right, using mobile techniques.
Oh yeah, quite successfully. They used what they called Wandertechnik mobile beekeeping, where the whole Bienenhaus or the whole Wanderwagen trailer would be moved to follow the nectar flow. It worked.
And these traditional systems, they use specific German standard frame sizes.
Yep, the well-proven domestic standards, Normalmaß and Kunstmaß. These were super reliable, deeply entrenched. They were products of this national tradition that really valued meticulous craftsmanship in these large, kind of semi-permanent structures.
But this tradition, it sounds like it was starting to hit a wall, especially compared to what was happening globally.
It really was. The wall of global economics, you could say.
Yeah.
All over the world, stackable box systems, the Magazine were becoming the absolute gold standard for efficiency. Especially if you were running a commercial operation or even just a serious part-time gig with a lot of hives.
Because with the magazine system, you handle whole boxes, right? Not fiddling with individual frames.
Exactly. You manipulate entire boxes or Zargen. It massively cuts down on labor time. Huge difference.
But adopting that in the GDR, it wasn't just like swapping out a box for another box.
Oh, God, no. It meant a total overhaul. Every single piece of equipment, every established cultural practice, and maybe most importantly, it challenged that mental connection the beekeeper had with their beautiful traditional bee in house. That was a big deal.
And this cultural resistance, it immediately ran into problems with the state planning system, didn't it?
Straight away. Because, see, there wasn't a standardized, mass-produced magazine hive available at first. So the early adopters, the pioneers, they basically had to become DIY manufacturers. They were building their own.
And the result was predictable, I guess.
Utter chaos, which the source captures perfectly with this wonderful German term, Remkenmaßwirrwarr.
Frame-size chaos?
Frame-size chaos, yeah. Just in the north of the Republic, the sources say at least 3 different new standards were popping up. Homemade standards.
Oh, man, I can just imagine the nightmare. Trying to move colonies, sell equipment. If your frames don't fit my boxes, the whole point of the modern system interchangeability scaling up, it just disappeared.
That's the critical point. And you have to remember, in a centrally planned economy like the GDR, this kind of organic, messy, bottom-up technical fragmentation, it just couldn't be tolerated for long.
Right. Standardization wasn't like a market choice. It was a state requirement.
Exactly. A highly controlled requirement. They needed to make sure that what little production capacity they actually had wasn't being totally wasted, making incompatible bits and pieces. They needed a unified national effort to impose some kind of order.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the state wasn't exactly leading the charge here. It was more like grassroots innovators were forcing the state's hand.
That's right. The real catalyst for this national debate, and it was raging right up to 1988, was a group of innovators, a Neuer collective, led by these 2 guys, Wolfgang Pienke and Jürgen Blom.
And they came up with a specific answer.
They did. They developed and championed their Schwerin Combination Magazine. And here's the really key detail. They somehow managed to get this new innovative hive design into serial production through a state-owned enterprise, the VEB Spezialbau Potsdam.
Okay, hang on. VED. Let's define that for, say, our listeners in the U.S. Volkseigener Betrieb, state-owned enterprise.
Right. It means the factory, the machines, the wood, the workers' time, it all technically belonged to the people, which in practice meant it was strictly controlled by central government planners.
So for a bunch of beekeepers to actually persuade or maybe pressure VEB Spezialbau Potsdam to start tooling up to make a completely new type of hive, one based on a global standard, not a German one, that's a huge deal. Bureaucratically, politically.
It tells you so much about the level of organized, bottom-up cleverness they must have used. They basically leveraged the official channels for innovation, the Neuerwiesen that existed within the socialist system, to kind of push their own modernization agenda.
They weren't just asking for permission, they were demanding production.
Pretty much. And their demand focused squarely on a frame size that meant turning their backs on decades, even centuries, of German beekeeping heritage.
Which brings us right to it. Langstroth. Why on earth did these East German innovators look past their own history, their Normalmaß, their Kunstmaß, and pick a standard developed back in the 1850s in, of all places, the United States?
Well, they didn't just pick any standard. They picked the undisputed global champion, the Langstroth Maß. Specifically, that frame size of 448 millimeters by 232 millimeters.
That must have been heresy to the traditionalists. You know, people who saw Normalmaß as inherently German, probably better. How did the innovators justify rejecting these domestic standards that had worked since, like, the 1840s?
Their justification, at least the one they put forward officially, was purely practical and very global-looking. They pointed out that roughly 52%, over half of the world's beekeepers, were successfully using the Langstroth measure.
Huh. So it was less about national pride and more about what works.
Exactly. It shows this really fascinating aspect of the late GDR mentality, especially among technical people. This desire to connect with proven international standards, things that weren't necessarily invented or approved within the GDR system. It was like a quiet admission that maybe their closed national systems weren't always the best, technically speaking.
It's almost a kind of like intellectual dissent, isn't it? It's saying, look, we respect our traditions, but if we actually want to be productive in today's world, we have to admit the rest of the world figured out a better way to build a bee box.
Absolutely. They were framing the argument not around culture, but around physics.
Yeah.
Biology, even. And that biology really boiled down to needing what they call the big wabe, the large comb, especially important in the context of the simple, often uninsulated magazine hive.
Okay, let's get into that technical detail because this is where it stops being just about culture and starts being about, well, applied physics for bees. Why does a bigger comb matter so much more in a basic box hive compared to those old traditional ones?
Right, so we look to the expert cited in the sources, a guy named Heinz Lorenz. He stated it pretty clearly. A simple walled magazine hive, just a thin wooden box, basically needs a comb length over 40 centimeters for optimal results.
40 centimeters. Okay.
Now, remember those traditional German hives, the Hinterbehandlungsbüten? They were often inside these thick wooden Bienenhäuser, or built into those heavy Wanderwagen. They had fantastic natural insulation. The magazine hive, just a stack of simple boxes, much less thermal protection.
Ah, okay. So the bee cluster itself generating its own heat. It needs the food stores, the honey, to act as a thermal buffer. The comb isn't just storage, it's part of the insulation system.
Precisely. And that leads us right to this concept of the Zerweg. It translates roughly as the consumption path.
Consumption path, like
Okay.
the route the bees eat through the honey.
Exactly. Think of the comb length as the colony's winter pantry or fuel tank. The cluster of bees starts eating at the bottom of the comb in the autumn, and they slowly work their way up, consuming the honey, moving across the face of the comb all winter long.
Okay, so if that pantry, that comb is too short, they eat through the honey too fast and hit the cold, uninsulated wooden side walls where it's drafty or just too cold.
That's the danger. The Langstroth frame, at 448 millimeters long, guarantees a sufficiently long Zerweg. It allows that cluster to survive the long, often cold East German winter by eating its way across the honey, without exposing itself too early to the vulnerable, thin wooden walls of the magazine box itself.
And this is exactly where the traditional German standards failed when you put them inside a simple magazine box.
Yes. The traditional Normalmaß, at only 370 millimeters long by 223 deep, was just too short. Lorenz detailed how this smaller size forces the bees to use way more puffer zone and buffer zones, basically empty comb just on the sides for insulation, inside that simple walled box.
So they're leaving comb empty just to stay warm.
Effectively, yes.
Okay.
It dramatically reduces the usable space for actual honey storage or for brood rearing.
So wait, you're making the same size box, but because the frame inside is too short, a big chunk of that internal space gets wasted. It's basically functioning as emergency insulation instead of productive space.
You got it. And that has an immediate direct economic consequence, especially painful in the scarcity economy of the GDR. The sources state it plainly. If you tried to use the smaller normal moss frames in a magazine format, you would need one extra brood box, one whole extra Zarge to get the same strength colony as you would with the Langstroth system.
Oh, one more box per hive. That's exponentially more wood, more weight for transport, more production effort for that poor VEB Spezialbau Potsdam.
More labor for the beekeeper, higher costs all around in a system that was absolutely desperate to use resources efficiently.
So the Langstroth choice wasn't just about copying the world. It was a cold, hard calculation of efficiency.
Pure rationalization. And the final decision reflects this technical victory. The Langstroth moss was officially chosen as the third main standard, but, and this is key exclusively for magazine beekeeping in the GDR.
So they didn't ban the old ways.
No. The normal and Kunstmaß remained the official standards for anyone sticking with the traditional rear access hives. It was the state trying to manage this really painful, decades overdue transition without completely alienating a powerful traditionalist wing of the beekeeping community, a very GDR compromise.
Okay, so the innovators, Pienke and Blom and their group, they won the technical argument. They got Langstroth approved. They even got production assigned to the VEB Spezialbau Potsdam. This should be the happy ending, right? Mission accomplished.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But no. This is the GDR, 1987. And this is where the ideal plan crashes headfirst into the reality of the Mangelfurt shaft, the shortage economy.
Ah, standardization on paper is one thing.
Producing standardized things reliably is quite another.
So what actually happened when VE Spezialbau Potsdam started trying to make these new Langstroth hives?
Well, the collision between innovation and systemic failure is immediate. It's right there in the sources. Despite all that effort to standardize on Langstroth, the production quality was instantly a huge problem. Oh, yeah. The very innovators who pushed for the system, they had to admit, publicly in the journal, that the production of the most critical wooden parts of the frames, the Rahmchen, quote, did still not meet our expectations.
Ouch.
And they went further. They specified that the current version coming off the line could only be considered an interim solution.
Interim solution. That's some serious socialist planner jargon for These things are basically unusable, isn't it?
It's diplomatic language for the system is failing to make the most basic component correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Think about what bad frames mean for a magazine system.
Yeah.
The whole point is that frames are perfectly interchangeable between any box.
Right. Smooth operation.
But if the wood is warped because it wasn't seasoned properly, if the dimensions are off because the machinery is old or poorly maintained, if the joints are weak,
Yeah.
the whole efficiency gain just evaporates.
Yeah.
The beekeeper is back to manually fiddling, maybe even having to discard frames. It reintroduces chaos right back into the system standardization was supposed to fix.
That says everything about resource allocation, doesn't it? Even when the state approves a modern, efficient design for something important, like food production, the factories still can't reliably get the basic inputs, like decent quality wood, or maintain the machinery to make simple wooden side rails accurately.
It speaks volumes. Good quality, properly seasoned wood was probably scarce, maybe reserved for export to get hard currency, or for, higher priority party construction projects. The beekeeper struggle was just a tiny reflection of the whole GDR economy grinding against its own limitations. And what do the innovators immediately suggest to fix the bad wood problem?
The sources mention they asked for plastic, right? Plast for the side parts.
Hell. Which seems like a modern solution, but think about it, it's actually a desperate attempt to engineer their way around the fundamental failure of the state's wood processing industry.
They wanted to bypass the bad wood problem entirely.
They were dreaming of better, more consistent, modern materials. But we're talking specialized plastics, maybe high-quality resins, things that were probably even scarcer than good wood or would have to be imported using hard currency the state didn't have.
So, sourcing the right kind of plastic might have been even more of a bureaucratic nightmare than getting good wood, even though the wood was domestic?
That's the tragic irony, isn't it? It shows the mental trap of the Mangelwirtschaft. They're trying to find a technical fix for a deep systemic problem. They knew wood quality was unreliable. They assumed plastic, being dimensionally stable, would solve it.
So they were willing to trade a known bad domestic material for a potentially impossible to get imported one.
Just to get the consistency their high-performance system demanded. Imagine designing this elegant, efficient system, getting it approved, and then having it totally bottlenecked because the factory couldn't make simple wooden side rails properly. The sheer exhaustion of that.
And the problems went beyond just quality, right? It was also about production capacity.
Oh, definitely. The VEB Spezialbau Potsdam initially only managed to produce the 23-depth Langstroth box, the shallower Zarge, even though the innovators argued, correctly, that the 11, the full-depth box, was also essential for proper management.
So the factory just couldn't keep up.
The state production machine just lagged behind the actual functional needs of the design. They couldn't scale up fast enough or maybe couldn't retool quickly enough to make both depths. So the innovators had to compromise their ideal system using suboptimal box depths just because that's all the VEB could reliably churn out.
Okay, this brings us to a really important comparison point you mentioned earlier, one that kind of throws the whole GDR situation into sharp relief, the Polish contrast.
Yes, this is so key for understanding the mentality, the mindset, but also the real systemic limitations of the GDR's planned economy versus others, even within the Soviet bloc. The sources point out, almost wistfully, that our Polish beekeeping friends are proud that they had managed to standardize down to only 6 hive types nationally.
Only 6? Wow.
And critically, the main ones were Langstroth and Dadant, the 2 big international standards.
So Poland, also a socialist state, somehow managed this decisive strategic cleanup. They just picked the global winners and moved on. Why was the GDR still wrestling with its own fragmented history, this cultural baggage going back to 1848?
I think it comes down to 2 things. The extreme inflexibility of the hyper-centralized GDR system, combined with that really deep, almost sentimental reverence for German tradition. The GDR approach always seemed to be about maintaining existing production lines, even the inefficient ones.
Because changing them was too disruptive.
Because overhauling them required huge coordinated shifts in resources that were already scarce labor, materials, machinery. They couldn't just issue an order, okay, everyone, stop using normal moss tomorrow. The cultural inertia, that legacy of the 1848 Association, where it basically defined proper German beekeeping by those specific dimensions and the whole Bienenhaus aesthetic, it was just too strong to overcome quickly.
So the GDR gets stuck trying to introduce Langstroth as a third major standard without killing off the other 2. Poland, meanwhile.
Poland somehow managed to just discard their older, fragmented national systems and adopt the 2 globally dominant ones, Langstroth and Dadant. It suggests maybe their central planning was a bit more flexible, or maybe they just had different economic priorities that put raw efficiency ahead of preserving cultural legacy in this sector.
A cleaner break.
It seems like it. The Polish move implies their planners either had the power or the will to make a strategic decision and just align with global best practice. The GDR, though, was caught in this kind of technical paralysis. They felt they had to support all three standards simultaneously, the two traditional, the one new, which just compounded the production headaches for the VEBs.
And this whole transition, even though it was technically better on paper, it still came with real costs, right? Financially, but also culturally, challenging that traditional German beekeeper identity.
Absolutely. The magazine system was a fundamental shift. It was changing beekeeping from this, meticulous, slow craft practiced in these beautiful, specialized buildings into something faster, more rationalized, almost industrial, using what looked like crude wooden boxes.
But the economics must have pushed it forward. The sources say the new magazine Hive was not cheap, but the argument was that other costs went away.
That was the clincher. Let's look at the numbers they used. In 1987, East German marks. A traditional Norm boot, properly set up in a standard commercial mobile trailer, a Wanderwagen. That cost about 600 marks.
Which was serious money back then, especially for a part-timer.
A very serious investment. Magazine system, though the individual boxes weren't free, completely eliminated the need for those huge, expensive Bienenhäuser or those complex, specialized trailers for moving the hives. You could just stack the simple boxes on a basic flatbed truck. Much simpler, much cheaper infrastructure.
And the wood argument, too.
Crucial in a scarcity economy. They even calculated the wood volume. The magazine hive needed about 0.151 cubic meters of wood, including waste. That was significantly less material than building the traditional three-room hive, plus the large bee house or trailer it absolutely required.
So saving wood, a critical resource, was a major selling point.
A huge selling point. It helped push the Langstroth adoption past the resistance from traditionalists. It was basically economic necessity dressed up as a technical choice.
So this whole hive war over 448 millimeters, it wasn't just about frame size. It was a fight for rational productivity, a battle against constant resource shortages, and yeah, a really painful letting go of this century-old cultural image defined by the Bean House. The magazine system was just the only way forward that seemed affordable and efficient enough in that strained system.
And this brings us to the actual management style that the magazine system forced on beekeepers. It wasn't just new boxes. It demanded a complete umdenken, a total shift in thinking.
A mind shift.
Yeah. The sources are blunt about it. The traditional operating method brings no success with magazines. You couldn't just use the new boxes like the old ones.
That's a strong statement. They're basically saying the efficiency is in the method, not just the equipment. So what defined this new philosophy?
It's all built on interchangeability and dynamic sizing. If a better component comes along, say, a new type of bottom board with better ventilation, you just swap out that part. You don't need a whole new hive setup.
Modularity.
Exactly. And crucially, you can constantly adjust the hive size, adding or removing boxes to match the exact strength of the colony at any given time. No wasted space, maximum efficiency throughout the year.
And the biggest selling point, especially for the state planners worried about productivity, must have been the time savings.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The innovators claimed, and this is a huge claim, that they needed less than a third of the processing time per hive compared to working with the traditional Norm Butte.
Less than a third, wow.
Think about that productivity gain.
Oh.
It was essential if you wanted to run larger operations or just manage the intense workload during the summer nectar flows. Traditional methods required so much meticulous handling of individual frames. This was about speed, scale, rationalized labor catnip for a planned economy struggling with labor shortages.
Well, they give that really striking example of this speed, using something called the universal bottom and a bee escape.
Yes, the Bienenflucht.
Yes.
This is brilliant efficiency engineering born from pressure. With that specific setup, they could clear a whole honey super, a box full of honey of bees, in just 24 to 36 hours.
How does that work?
The bee escape is like a little one-way door. You put it between the honey boxes you want to harvest and the main brood nest below. The bees can go down through it, back to the brood area, but they can't get back up into the honey supers.
Ah, clever.
So the beekeeper just puts it on, comes back the next day or day after, and the honey box is basically empty of bees, ready to be lifted off and taken for extraction. The sources boast that for 30 colonies, the whole harvest becomes, quote, a job done before breakfast.
That sounds absolutely revolutionary compared to, like, smoking bees out or brushing them off every single frame.
It was a total game changer. That speed, that predictability, it was fundamental to making this high-performance system work.
But even with this new efficiency, the switch wasn't perfect, was it? There were new problems, especially with managing the brood in those big Langstroth boxes.
No, it wasn't perfect. The large Langstroth frames, especially if you used 2 of the 23 depth boxes for the brood nest, created this huge potential brood area, actually larger than the other big international standard, the data system, by over 11%.
Okay, big brood nest sounds good, right? Lots of bees.
You'd think so. But the problem was almost the opposite. The colonies became too good at raising brood, which counterintuitively led to completely unsatisfactory honey yields
Wait, how does having more bees lead to less honey?
because of the nectar flows in that part of Germany. They were often interrupted. Trockunterbrechen. You'd get a good flow, then maybe a week of bad weather, then another flow. When the flow stopped, that massive population of developing brood consumed the stored honey like crazy.
Ah, so they were producing tons of bees, but the bees were just eating the profits before the beekeeper could harvest it.
Exactly. They were eating the honey as fast as it came in during those gaps. So the solution required this really aggressive, almost feels wrong management technique. Time-based brood restriction.
Restricting the queen.
Yes, using a queen excluder, the abspergitter. It demanded intense attention from the beekeeper. You had to watch the nectar flow like a hawk. The goal was to build up a massive bee population just before the main flow hit, especially that crucial rapeseed flow, the abstract.
Okay, maximum workforce ready to go.
Right. But then, once the main flow was really on, you had to trap the queen down in the lower box or boxes using the excluder. This forced the bees to store all the incoming nectar as surplus honey in the upper boxes, where the queen couldn't lay, preventing it from being immediately eaten by new brood.
Wow. That's not casual backyard beekeeping. That's high-precision agricultural engineering. They had to be real technicians.
Absolutely. Managing inputs and outputs almost like a factory. It shows the high expectations placed on them to make the system productive despite the landscape challenges.
Let's dig into some of the specific components they developed or adapted to make this simple box system work better, especially given the production issues. We mentioned the bad frames, but the hive structure itself had some clever adaptations. First, the false. What's that?
The false is the rebate, that little lip or groove around the top and bottom edges of the boxes so they interlock snugly. Now, the expert Heinz Lorenz, he initially didn't recommend them because it made production more complex for the VEB factory. More machining steps, more chances for error, use slightly more wood, all bad things in the Mangelwirtschaft.
But the beekeepers found it necessary anyway.
They did, for practical, real-world reasons. 2 main ones. First, security during migration wandering. When you're hauling 30 or 40 hives down a bumpy road on a trailer, that interlocking rebate stopped the boxes from shifting or sliding apart. Essential safety.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, and really important for bee health, it helped with varroa mite treatments. By sealing the boxes together better, it prevented drafts and made fumigation or other treatments that required a sealed environment much more effective.
So the benefits outweighed the production hassle.
Apparently so. The trade-off was, yes, you might crush a few more bees when putting the boxes back together and it was harder for the factory, but the security and the treatment efficacy won out.
Okay, next clever component. The universal bottom, the Zwischenboden. This sounds like peak GDR design, one thing doing multiple jobs because you can't get multiple things made.
That's the absolute core philosophy of innovation under scarcity. Multifunctional design. The universal bottom was specifically developed to replace separate parts from earlier prototypes, like a dedicated feeder bottom and a separate bee escape board.
So what could this one board do?
Okay, it functioned as a feeder bottom, designed efficiently, so they only needed maybe 3 main feedings a year. Huge time saver. It acted as the bee escape board for that quick harvesting method we talked about. It served as a secure divider board for splitting colonies or merging them. And it could be used as a solid base for starting small nucleus colonies, or nooks.
Incredible. One piece of wood replacing maybe 4 different specialized tools.
Exactly. That's smart engineering anywhere, but absolutely vital when you know the VEB is struggling to produce even simple things reliably. It cuts down complexity in the production chain, and it simplifies life for the beekeeper, fewer bits to buy, store, and manage.
All right, let's talk about their approach to swarm prevention. This sounds intense, even radical. It really shows the lengths they'd go to for productivity.
It is ruthless, purely efficiency-driven, designed to eliminate the one thing that absolutely wrecks a planned honey harvest: swarming. If a colony decided it wanted to swarm right in the middle of a major nectar flow,
They didn't try to manage it gently.
no gentle management here. The protocol was rigorously remove all the brood boxes, leaving the bees behind, shaken down into the bottom box, and then treat those remaining bees as if they were a freshly caught swarm, a feegling.
Whoa, so they basically destroyed the existing colony structure and forced a complete reset. Why the nuclear option?
Because, as the sources state, a swarm is surpassed by nothing in its vitality. By artificially creating the conditions of a swarm, no brood to feed, nowhere to store honey, initially they shocked the colony's biology. It stopped the brooding cycle that was eating honey and triggered a massive surge in foraging instinct in this newly homeless, highly motivated colony.
So it actually boosted the harvest.
It maintained or even boosted performance during the flow. And, crucially, it created the perfect opportunity for varroa mite treatment. Treating a colony with no sealed brood is far more effective at knocking down mite populations, so they combined aggressive management with necessary pest control.
That is definitely turning beekeeping into high-yield livestock management. Very rationalized.
Extremely rationalized. And finally, we have to mention the variable high bottom, another multitasking component designed for efficiency and dealing with varroa.
What did this one do?
Primarily three things. One, it provided essential extra ventilation space underneath the cluster during transport, which is critical when moving bees in summer. Two, it usually incorporated a screened bottom, allowing for varroa mite monitoring. You could slide a sticky board underneath and count the mites that dropped, checking treatment efficacy. Three, it allowed for stimulative feeding Reisfütterung underneath the bee cluster, which was considered beneficial in spring, and it was key to their radical wintering strategy.
Ah, yes, the cold wintering. Kulturwinterung. That sounds risky.
It was a calculated risk, definitely,
Mm-hmm.
but only for the strongest colonies. For these really robust units, they would overwinter them by completely removing the solid bottom slide, leaving only the screen. The colony literally seized the grass underneath, as the source says.
Open to the elements.
Open bottom. The idea was it ensured a perfectly dry hive environment, preventing moisture buildup, which is deadly for bees in winter. But this is a huge, but it was only viable for extremely strong colonies, wintering on maybe 30 or 40 fully occupied combs. Huge colonies.
So the system itself demanded high performance just to survive the winter using their methods.
Exactly. And the innovators were very clear. Smaller or weaker colonies. They needed more warmth. They simply did not belong in a magazine hive under this management style. They had to be wintered in traditional hives or combined or just wouldn't make it. The magazine system, as they practiced it, was for the elite performers only.
So this new magazine system, it wasn't just changing the boxes and the management, it actually changed how they saw the bees themselves. Specifically, the main strain they used in East Germany, the Carnica bee.
It really did. There might have been this traditional wisdom, maybe tied to those older, smaller, more sheltered hives, that Carnica bees needed cozy conditions, maybe smaller units, to get through the winter okay.
Right, that they weren't suited for big, cold boxes.
Exactly. But the magazine system, when managed correctly with these new techniques, it basically proved that wrong. It showed that the management was the key factor, not necessarily the inherent size of the cavity or the bee strain itself.
So it was like a biological revelation enabled by the new tech.
You could say that. It demonstrated that Carnica bees were perfectly capable of overwintering successfully in these large units. Remember, 30 to 40 combs strong, without needing the old practice of combining them with smaller nucleus colonies, the ablature, just for extra warmth.
Yeah.
They could handle it if the colony was strong enough and dry enough.
And the specific management they used for Carnica reflected this high-performance approach.
Absolutely. Starting in spring with that Reizfütterung, the stimulative feeding below the cluster, to get the queen laying really early and strong. And then, crucially, this aggressive frame exchange, the Zorgentausch.
Swapping whole boxes around.
Yeah, physically swapping the positions of brood boxes to manipulate where the food stores were. This encouraged the bees to move honey up, making space below, effectively forcing the queen to expand the brood nest rapidly to build that massive population needed for the early nectar flows. Very interventionist.
And all this manipulation, this focus on population dynamics, it leads right into needing really efficient ways to make new colonies, right? For high-speed queen rearing, the Alblagerbildung, you need replacements if you're pushing them this hard.
Exactly. You need a constant supply of young, vigorous colonies and queens. And again, that clever universal bottom board made this super efficient. They developed a method to create new nucleus colonies, nukes, without having to do the most time-consuming job in beekeeping. finding the old queen in a huge colony.
Oh, finding the queen can take forever. How did they get around that?
They use the queen's natural tendency to stay down in the lower brood boxes. So they take an upper box that was full of brood, separate it from the queen right section below using the universal bottom, maybe with some honey frames in between. Now you have a queenless box on top.
Okay.
They'd wait 8 or 9 days. This allows any emergency queen cells, the bees might have started to become visible and be destroyed.
Mhm.
Then they introduce a new, high-quality, specially reared queen into that top box, usually under a little cage with a candy plug the bees eat through to release her slowly.
Brilliant. Minimal disturbance. No searching for the old queen downstairs. Just create a queenless unit upstairs and pop in a new one.
Massively saves labor. And for combining colonies, say uniting a weak one with a strong one, they'd often just use a sheet of newspaper between the boxes. The bees chew through it slowly, the scents mingle gradually, and they usually accept the stronger queen, killing the weaker one. Again, very efficient, minimal fuss.
And this ties into their overall approach to queen quality, which sounds almost industrial. You call it ruthless quality selection.
It really was. To keep performance absolutely peaked, the standard operating procedure was no queen was kept past her second laying season. End of story. And if a queen showed any sign of underperforming, maybe her brood pattern wasn't perfect, maybe her colony wasn't building up fast enough, she was culled immediately, even in her first year.
Wow, no second chances.
No second chances for mediocrity. It's aggressive genetic selection, constantly renewing the stock with young, vigorous queens. And the same applied to whole colonies. If a colony looked unhealthy, they didn't waste time or resources trying to treat it and nurse it back. They just combined it with a strong, healthy neighbor.
That seems incredibly harsh from maybe a hobbyist perspective, but I guess it makes cold, hard sense if you're running a large operation where every kilo of honey counts, especially under GDR conditions.
It's a mindset completely focused on maximizing high-quality production. You actually reduce your total hive count temporarily by getting rid of the weak links, but you're constantly refilling those slots by raising 30, 40, even 50% new, young, healthy colonies every single year from your best stock.
It's like applying almost capitalist efficiency principles within a socialist state framework.
Driven by the absolute, unrelenting pressure of resource scarcity and the need for productivity. It's a world away from the romantic image of the old beekeeper tending his hives in the bean house. This was performance agriculture. #outro.
Okay. So we started this deep dive thinking we were looking at a pretty niche debate, wooden frames in East Germany back in '87. But what we found was this technical fight over millimeters and insulation that actually mirrored the entire nation's broader struggles.
Yeah, the beekeepers' battle to get the Langstroth measure adopted, it was a direct clash with the failures of the Mangelwirtschaft, the shortage economy, and also with this incredibly powerful pull of cultural tradition stretching back well over a century.
The fight for Langstroth, it really was a fight for rationalized productivity, wasn't it? In a world where scarcity was just...
Absolutely. And that sharp contrast with Poland next door, who just seemed to strategically pick the global winners, Langstroth and Dedant, and move on, it really highlights how rigid the GDR's planning system was and how strong that cultural inertia, that reverence for the old German ways really was.
And the struggle of the Schwerin Magazine innovators just to get basic, decent quality wooden frames made by the VEB Spezialbau Potsdam. It shows how the state planning system could actually sabotage its own goals for efficiency.
Right. It proves that for that GDR beekeeper, trying to modernize wasn't just buying new equipment. It was this huge act of willpower, overcoming systemic hurdles, material shortages, and deep-seated tradition, all at the same time.
It demanded that total shift in thinking, that Umdenken, and accepting this much higher, much tougher, frankly more brutal standard of performance, partly just to make the inefficient state supply system actually work for them.
They had to become world-class innovators and managers almost, just to compensate for the poor quality of their basic tools and the system's inflexibility.
So what does this all mean for you listening today?
Well, consider this. All that clever innovation we talked about, the universal bottom, the variable high bottom, that radical swarm prevention method, so much of it was driven by the sheer difficulty of getting basic, reliable components. How much did that constant mental and physical effort, the struggle just to push innovation through that system, how much did that tax the average beekeeper?
Yeah.
And did that intense effort, that constant need to engineer workarounds for scarcity, did it fundamentally change how they value the final product, the hive, the honey, compared to maybe a beekeeper in a market economy who could just order reliable, standardized stuff from a catalog without a second thought?
That's a fascinating question.
The hive debate, in the end, wasn't just about bees. It was a profound lesson in the true human cost of systemic inefficiency.